Thanks to everyone for coming. I know you have very busy schedules, so I appreciate you fitting this in. I should mention that if you want a second version of this, seeing it again, you can fly to Poland, go to Warsaw on Friday, and Professor Kirsting will be presenting it there. So you can have it twice if you really are that into it. The reason we call this Redux is that this is a topic that's been researched a lot. And so it's not that we're the first ones to say, I wonder if there's a link between foreign aid and democracy. But we think that there are some important things that have been missed in the past, different approaches we can take, and we're hoping to shed new light on this. And I hope by the end of the talk you'll agree with me. Well, I guess we'll see. The questions that we're looking at here can roughly be thought as, in general, does aid promote democracy? And we're going to distinguish between the long run and the short run. So the long run we'll be thinking about, does aid flowing over several decades lead to movement toward democracy in recipient countries? And when we talk about the short run, we're looking at, does aid have an impact in a year or two, something along that time frame? So looking at the short run impact instead. There are reasons to think that different approaches will capture different things better, and that's why we want to look at it in both ways. In looking at this, an obvious question is, if aid does promote democracy, how does it promote democracy? Can we pick apart different mechanisms through which it might support democracy? So we're going to be looking at two. We're going to refine it just a little bit more, but looking at two ways. One is that aid could function as an input into democracy. So in other words, a resource that's needed or helpful for promoting democratic development in a country. And the alternative is that it could be as an incentive. In other words, on its own, it might not be needed, but it may give decision makers an incentive to pursue reforms towards democracy because they're interested in receiving the aid. So those are the two ways when we say, how does democracy, aid promote democracy? That's the kinds of things we're thinking about. All right. Again, just to give you sort of a more detailed way of thinking about this, and this is roughly how we've organized our thought and how we've organized our reading of the existing literature. We can think about foreign aid playing one of three roles. Two of them are in the input category I talked about, and the last one as incentive. So we can think about aid as a general input into the economy. And here we're thinking about, as I said before, the long run. So if you think about aid as a general input, it's not specifically there to promote democracy, but it may be promoting growth in the country. And growth may be linked to democracy. So for example, economists have this idea of a normal good. A normal good is one when your income is higher, you want more of it, all right? As contrasted to an inferior good, when your income is higher, you want less of it. So if you think about orange juice, when your income is higher, you want more, up to a point, whereas some knockoff Tang kind of substitute for orange juice, as your income goes higher, you want less of it. So the argument here is simply that if democracy is a normal good, richer countries, as sort of a part of their consumption, would want democracy. Okay? So that's one way of thinking of it as a normal good, but we can also think about aid as promoting education. And it may be, many people have argued, that an educated electorate is a necessary prerequisite for a well-functioning democracy. So if over the course of several decades, foreign aid directed toward the education sector can increase primary school completion rates and maybe increase secondary school completion rates, then we might see that as a foundation for future steps toward democracy. We can also think about aid as supporting civil society. So if, again, over the course of decades of aid is building up the strength of civil society within the country, that may be the bedrock, the foundation to move forward toward a better functioning democracy. So those are all things where you don't think the dollar today is going to turn into democracy tomorrow. And in fact, the measurable output in any reasonable time frame, in a couple of years, is not democracy at all, but it may be generating things that then support future steps for democracy. So that's what we mean by general input, right? It's not per se about democracy at all, but it is very much linked to the long run. We can also think about aid flows as being specific inputs. So a specific input means it was intended to promote democracy. And there we're thinking short run, all right? So over the course of a year or several years, you might have aid flowing in to support a free media in the country, or to support election commissions, or to train poll workers, or to provide funding for a variety of political parties. A whole bunch of things that in a short period of time you think are necessary inputs are going to be useful for having a successful election, or in general promoting steps towards democracy, democratic reform. So those things are both specific in that they're targeted, and also the time frame is very different, right? We're not thinking that you need to provide election support for 3 decades before you begin to see an effect on elections themselves. It should be relatively immediate. And then finally, and this is, so these arrows are supposed to sort of capture the timing as well. As the country is moving toward democracy, making steps, baby steps, maybe big steps, depending on the situation, toward democracy, donors can offer aid as an incentive, right? If you release a bunch of political prisoners, we'll give you some aid. If you ease up on the media, allow more of a free media, we'll give you aid. If you run an election that seems to be roughly free and fair, then there may be more aid flowing to your country. And that is, again, a short-term kind of thing, so we're not talking about over decades. But the timing is different in that the aid that's acting as an incentive would be flowing after the event rather than before the event, right? So it doesn't make any sense to say, here's a little incentive to do something, and then you're supposed to do it after I give it to you, because you've already got the money, right? There's nothing to be done about it. So that's with the dotted circle and whatnot to say it's after the event takes place, then the aid would flow, all right? So that gives us a reasonably clear structure to think about this, ways of looking at how aid can promote democracy and beginning to look at empirically evaluating this. In other words, taking real world data and saying, can we see relationships here? All right. I should have said right at the very beginning, I'm happy to have people stop me with questions, clarification, anywhere along the way. So feel free to dive in if there's something that's not clear. All right, so what I'd like to turn to now, I mentioned that there's a very big literature already looking at this, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. I tried to put down things that I thought were interesting and sort of motivation, at least in some ways, but I'm not going to talk about all of them. I'd like to focus on a few. You can see I've dumped them into my categories. We've put them in our categories of general input, specific input, and incentive. All right. This isn't how the literature is itself structured. This is us looking at the literature and thinking, really, you could sort it out this way. So hopefully that's a good way of thinking about it. A lot of what we do is actually going to be focusing initially in this category, and then we're going to focus more on that category in the second part of the paper. And in this group of these 3 papers, I'm sure there are others, but these are the 3 that are most cited. There's actually the paper by Steve Knack, who's at the World Bank, is cited by far more than any of the other papers here, right? So 300-400 different citations of this paper. And so we can consider that essentially when anybody is writing about aid, they're going to cite that paper. And what they say is, as Knack 2004 showed, aid has no impact on democracy. So what Knack did, and again, as a general input, it's looking at long period of time, looking at decades. He takes the level of democracy of a country in 1995 and the level of democracy in a country in 2000. I'm going to come back and talk about how these levels of democracy are measured. It's an index, more or less. But looking at those, and he looks at the change across that 25-year period. And then he attempts to, he puts in aid as one of the explanatory variables, one of the things that's supposed to explain why some countries made great strides toward democracy, why maybe some other countries moved away from democracy. He puts aid in and a bunch of other things to try to explain it. And in a quite thorough analysis, looking at lots of different possibilities, every time he winds up with the estimated effect of aid is not significantly different from 0. In other words, in the jargon, there's no statistical significance for aid. On the plus side, it's a positive coefficient, but it's not different from 0, so basically aid doesn't seem to be accomplishing anything. All right? So everybody takes that as their starting point. As we see in the long run, aid doesn't have an effect on democracy. And that's something that we're going to be re-examining here that we think is worth looking at again. These other 2 papers actually look more narrowly. His is a global sample across 25 years. Goldsmith looks at a sample in sub-Saharan Africa across probably about a 15-year period and finds a small positive effect. Heppelman looks at transition economies in the 1990s and again finds a positive effect, but those get no play in the literature. Everybody focuses on NAC. And you'll see that, in a way, we're going to focus on NAC too, since that's, like, if you want to convince people that there's a different answer, that's what you have to go after. There's a whole literature on aid as a specific input, and some of these papers say, well, we shouldn't just include all the money that goes to a country. If it's a specific input, let's try to identify just that money, right? So for example, the first paper here, Scott and Steele, they look at aid coming from a specific institution in the United States called the National Endowment for Democracy. And it literally channels aid to countries that are close to having elections, trying to push forward free and fair elections. And they find no effect, all right? Possibly because they're talking about trivial amounts of money. There's just, when you start looking that narrowly, there's not a lot going on. Other folks in here, some of them are finding positive effects, some of them are finding negative effects, some of them are finding no effects. So there are a lot of different definitions of what are we going to count as democracy aid. There are many different ways of slicing this. There are different time periods to look at. There are different ways of trying to capture what is democracy. But there's largely there's not a lot of consensus in that group. All right? And we're not diving too deep into that because it's kind of a mucky area and because of that. There are some papers that I would classify as looking at aid as an incentive. And the one that I'm going to focus on a bit is Bermeo, Sarah Bermeo, who is at Duke. Quite an interesting paper, and it looks at countries making a transition to democracy. So by that, she says that they're not just making a baby step. So we have an index that has little steps of 1. She's looking only when that's a step of 3. In 1 year, boom, it moved toward democracy, at least 3 steps. All right, so looking for big transitions toward democracy. And very interesting approach in that she says, look, there are different kinds of donors out there. They're what we all think of as sort of the traditional donors from the OECD countries who have been giving aid, many of them giving aid since World War II or ramped up in the 1960s, but for a long time. And they all share a pretty common agenda that democracy is the way to govern a country, and that they either give lip service or maybe more to wanting to promote that internationally. All right? But there are other donors out there, the OPEC donors, which she calls the authoritarian donors, who don't have democracies at home, and as you might guess, aren't really so interested in promoting democracy abroad, right? It's not very consistent with having a monarchy at home or some other system. And they also control some of the international organizations. So there are a couple of OPEC Fund for International Development and other things where they control it. So she breaks aid apart from the sort of democratic donors and the autocratic donors. And then she looks at which ones of these are linked, which flows of aid are linked to a higher probability of making a big step toward democracy. Okay? And she finds that from the traditional donors, these OECD donors, the more aid you get, the more likely you have one of these transitions toward democracy. Okay? In 1 year, you take at least 3 steps. She also then looks at these autocratic donors and finds that you don't see that positive link. In fact, there may be a negative link, right? The more aid you get from the autocratic donors, the less likely you are to take a step toward democracy. And then she looks at whether, if you're getting aid from the autocratic regimes, the autocratic donors, does that change the effect of the OECD donors, of the democratic donors? And she finds, yes, that it undermines the effect of the democratic donors. And the argument then is very much focused on incentives, right? Because if your main source of money is going to be the democracy-loving, the democratic donors, I'm not sure I'd go as far as democracy-loving, but democratic donors, and they're threatening you, we're going to cut off the money if you don't do this. If you've got somebody else, then you don't have to listen to the threats. Whereas if you don't have the other person, then you do, or the other source of funding, then you do have to listen to the threats. So the fact that countries that are getting money from the autocratic donors are less responsive to the democratic donors suggests that you're capturing incentive effects. All right? So all that is very interesting, and if you're out there to read this, go read it. All right, 2011. I think it's in World Development for anyone who cares. But in any case, there are a few things that we consider to be shortcomings in that paper. One is, by looking at at these big 3 steps or more toward democracy. Those are rare events. So out of the 1,100 observations in her sample, 30 of them are these big steps toward democracy. All right? And so while it's great to see, yeah, we can be very sure these are steps toward democracy, you're potentially throwing out lots of information of the countries that took 2 steps or 1 step, right? And it's not like you're just sinking in information if you've only got 30 observations of the event that you're interested in. So that's one thing that we're going to try to do differently. In other words, use all the information you can get your hands on, all right, rather than indirectly throwing some of it away. The second thing is that, and I didn't tell you this, so now I'm telling you. In Bermeo's paper, she's looking at aid that flowed last year and the democratic transition this year, all right, which makes some sense. However, if you think about the incentives I talked about in that diagram, which I guess is just back here, it's supposed to be the aid after the event, not the aid before the event, okay? So that makes it a little bit hard to interpret because the timing is wrong. Now, why does she do the timing wrong? She's a smart person. Not that it didn't occur to her that the other timing would be better. It's rather that there's a bigger problem lurking here. It's fully possible that donors like democracy, but don't actually have any impact on it, right? So they could say, here, we'll give you the aid if you turn democratic, and the country, the ruler of the country is saying, yeah, so what, right? If they happen to turn democratic, then they get the aid. If they don't turn democratic, then they don't get the aid, but it wasn't causal, right? It's this reverse causation, correlation is not causation, usual story, all right? And that's clearly a major, major critique if you just did that, without thinking about it. So her best solution, and in fact, most of the literature's best solution is just let's get the timing wrong so the reverse causation story is less likely, but it then also isn't a logically consistent story of timing, all right? So that is another thing that we're hoping to address as we look back at this, all right? So in a sense, and we don't frame the paper quite like this, we're going to be diving into NAC, looking at the long run, looking at over the course of decades, and see whether there's something different that we can find, or maybe something the same. And then we're also, in a sense, looking at the same issues over here as I've characterized as Bermeo, to see whether we can make any progress there on getting the timing right, really getting at what we think are incentives. Okay. So I've said a whole lot. Does anybody want to stop me and ask questions, especially students from my class? You should feel free stopping me all the time. Nobody?
I wonder if you're going to talk about this, but are there differences in moving? I'm assuming you're using something like polity measures or something like that.
We're going to be using Freedom House.
Freedom House.
Mm-hmm.
That a movement from 1 to 2 has a different dimension than a movement from like 6 to 7. And might there be threshold effects then that
for future research. And after I finish explaining the design, I'd be very happy to hear suggestions about where to go with that. But you're not going to see that explored directly here. You're going to see a different kind of a structure. Okay, great. All right, so Professor Toyota is ahead of the rest of you because she's read half the literature already at least. So let me go ahead with this. All right, so that's talking about other people. I'm now going to switch to talking more directly about what we're doing. All right. So our innovations, that's to say, what are we doing? We're going to have an explicit model of the rating process. And this is not going to address the concerns that you have, what you just said, but it is going to address some other concerns. Okay? So we're going to have an explicit model of the rating process. So what do I mean by that? These measures of democracy aren't obvious, right? Their countries aren't going around with on their forehead a little number saying how democratic they are. So there are organizations, academics, all sorts of people out there happy to generate measures of democracy. And the 2 key ones are Freedom House, and you guys may have heard of reports about the Freedom in the World annual report coming out and who moved down and who moved up and so on. And there's also something referred to as polity or polity 4, which is often more preferred, I would say, by political scientists to the Freedom House. However, much of the literature we're looking at has in fact looked at Freedom House, and we're going to, and the NAC paper that I sort of highlighted on, this is the one to address. That one uses Freedom House, so our focus is going to be on that. All right. So we're going to look at specifically how does Freedom House generate these ratings. And we're not going to dive in as deep as you might expect from sort of a political science point of view into the nitty-gritty, but we're going to look at the mechanics of it and try to figure out what information can you glean from that to use these things in a more efficient way, a more rational way. All right, so there's going to be some talk about the rating process. As I hinted at before, we're going to focus very much on timing matters. So if we're looking at incentives, it has to be in some way the aid that's coming after the action rather than before. And we're going to focus on the role of expectations in incentive effects. And that is to say, we're going to try to identify the incentive effect through the strategic importance of a country, the geostrategic importance of a country to the data. All right, so at this point, I don't think this makes a whole lot of sense, but I want to at least give you the bird's eye view of where we're headed. And now you're about to see some of the nitty-gritty. Okay? All right, so the nitty-gritty starts with how does Freedom House generate its ratings? All right? At one level, it does it by using summer interns, folks coming out of Villanova and other places who might, as a summer project, be doing background research on what's been going on in Algeria, and then that's all fed into an expert assessment process that comes up with numbers, okay, that tries to translate that into numbers. I've had students before who've gone off and done summer internships at Freedom House doing exactly that. What they do is at an annual level, so every year they score countries it's done by country experts, on different categories that broadly fit into civil liberties or political rights. And those are aggregated together to think of as a measure overall of how democratic a country is, whether it's not free, partly free, or free. All right. The civil liberties is divided into 15 categories. And each of those categories, the expert gives a number somewhere between, integer between 0 and 4 as a rating for that country in that category. And likewise, there are 10 categories under political rights, again with a 0 to 4 in each category. And these then are summed up to come up with an overall measure. So 0 to 60 for civil liberties, 0 to 40 for political rights. In general, Freedom House doesn't report these numbers. Instead, they turn it into a 1 to 7 scale. So they take they take the number in each category, civil liberties number, and they turn that into somewhere in a 1 or a 7, between 1 and 7. And the same for political rights. And then if they talk about an overall score, they just do a simple average of those two. So they're putting equal weight on the political rights and civil liberties. It turns out, as I'm stating here, that the ratings are available all the way for a huge number of countries from 1972 to 2011. Last I looked, maybe the 2012s are available now. For a brief window, they were also publishing the scores, that underlying 1 to 100 or 0 to 60, 0 to 40 score was available, but only for a few years, and then they stopped doing that. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why the some political scientists I know don't like it, because they want to see what went into the sausage, not just the sausage, and they would like everything to be laid out, all the parts, so they could construct their own index of the subparts. Okay. The other score that Professor Toyota mentioned, polity, does allow you to do that. All the things are broken down, and you can come up with your own ideal way of measuring things. Okay. Right. Now, just as NAC did, we're going to be looking at changes in these ratings or changes in the scores. So rather than the level, we want to know how far did a country get over a 20, 30, 40-year period based on how much aid they got over that period. Okay? So we're going to be looking at changes of all these. Now, we get a nice picture to look at. What's traditionally been done in NAC and other places is simply to take the 1 to 7 scores and use that as what you're trying to explain in a regression analysis. That essentially ignores the discrete choppiness of them and just says, well, it's pretty close to continuous data. All right? When you're looking at scores, and particularly when you're looking at changes, that is going to create a problem. Right? If you think about it, let's say a country is currently, last year was at a 3, and this year moved to a 4. So there's a change of 1 in terms of the overall rating. What does that mean in terms of a score, the underlying 0 to 100? Or in this case, sorry, 0 to 60. it could be that there was hardly any change at all, right? You went just over the boundary, and you got a change in the rating. Or it could be that there was a very big change that was almost 2, but ended up being just short of that and coming into a change of 1. So there's a lot going on that could be different. Okay? And in particular, if you think about a change of 0, that could be that nothing happened, or it could be that you just barely didn't make it across the threshold. Now, why does that matter? Well, the standard regression framework is looking at when we see changes in aid, do we also then see changes in democracy, right? But this setup, if you ignore this measurement problem, there are often going to be times where aid changes, democracy doesn't move, right? So that, in the technical jargon, what that is called is an attenuation bias. It means that the standard method is going to be biased toward finding no effect, towards 0, that aid does not affect democracy. All right? In other words, it's more likely to generate the effect that NAC reports. Right? Now, NAC does go into various things, so I don't think that that's a complete critique of him, but it's consistent with that. Okay? So I realize this is getting into the weeds, but this is the kind of thing we're saying, look, if you did it more carefully and you used all the information that was available, maybe you're going to get something different. All right? Okay, so I don't want you to pay a whole lot of attention to this. This is just turning that discussion into a more mathematical format. In the end, we're going to be estimating equations that look like something like this. They've got a change in a civil liberties, political rights, or overall score that generally we can't actually observe, all right, as a function of aid, GDP, population, whatever. All those other things would be potential explanatory variables. And the trick here, if you want to call it a trick, is that we can write down a probability statement that takes into account that there's an interval behind the data that we're seeing, essentially. And the method that we're going to be using is something called an interval regression that's built exactly for doing this kind of thing, for data where it's really an interval that you're seeing. And the beauty of this is that it can incorporate all the information that we have. In years where no scores are reported, where only that rating, which was most of the years, are reported, it deals with that. In years where the scores are reported, and we literally see exactly what happened on this scale, right? If the scores are reported, we can see exactly what the change was at the minute level. This will also allow us to incorporate all that information. In a year where we see the score on one end and then just some general rating on the other, we can still incorporate all the information we have into this. All right? So in that sense, it's kind of the opposite of what Bermeo did. We're not throwing out any data. We've built what we would call a likelihood function that can capture all the information that's available, that can make use of all the information that's available. All right. The A's and the B's, so these things about where these cutoffs are, that diagram I showed you, that's known. Freedom House states what their cutoff levels are for what's a 3, what's a 4, and so on. So we've got that. I think I've more or less talked through all of that. And again, this is going to avoid the attenuation bias that's implicit in running the standard regression approach. Okay. How's everybody's glaze factor doing? So we now jump into the data. This is what we call descriptive statistics. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. It does give you a sense of what scores we're talking about, that the average is a 14 in terms of a change in the score. This is over a 25-year period. This is the 7-point rating, so it kind of shows you the mapping between the scores and the ratings. And we can, I guess the next one to really pay attention to is this DAC aid. So we're looking at aid coming from the traditional, essentially democratic donors. So the same group that Bermeo was looking at, and it, in fact, is the same group that NAC is looking at. And we report the aid, again, following NAC, as a percentage percentage of the GDP of the recipient country. So the 5 here means that the average country got 5% of its GDP as foreign aid.
So when we usually do this sort of thing,
That wasn't quite right, but yep.
we can, what we often use are 4 or 5 year non-overlapping time intervals to avoid shocks, avoid, occasional blips in the data and so forth, but because you're looking for an effect that comes fairly close onto some event.
You're one step ahead of me. This is the cross-sectional analysis where it's over a 25-year period. So there's one observation per country.
Yes.
So later I'll be doing that. But
so my question is, how do you get at, how do you control for these blips in the data, these shocks, while at the same time finding the effects, after, say, a year interval? You'll probably answer.
In some sense, you can say it's the error term if we haven't controlled for it, right? But yes, we'll get to that when we're talking about an annual regression. All right. So as I alluded to at the beginning, we're doing two sort of separate things. One is looking at a 25-year or whatever span, and that is one observation for a country. So how did it change from 1975 to 2000? So we'll have 122 countries, one observation for each of them that's saying what they did over that 25-year period. So that's going to be the analysis that we want to compare with NAC, where people have been saying over the long run, aid has no impact on democracy. That's what I'm focusing on now. Professor Toyota was getting ahead of us to say, when you switch this, and we are going to do that, switch it to looking at the annual level, how do you deal with the fact that sometimes there are these huge blips in the data, right? So that there's a $7 billion transfer to Egypt recorded, things like that in 1991. How do you deal with that? Okay. At the moment, we don't have to deal with that because we're looking at long averages. One thing we did that was different than NAC is that we required all countries to be included in the sample to have at least 20 years of data, because our measure of aid is an average, right? And if you are getting aid for 25 years, that average represents a lot of resources flowing. But if you're only getting it for 5 years, that average doesn't represent that many resources. So our way of dealing with this was to say, let's just look at countries that are pretty similar in terms of their aid experiences. We also took some other ways, like including as another control variable, how many years did they actually receive aid? Are they in the data set for? And a couple of other things. And as long as we have something that controls for that length, the results are very similar to what I report here. If we drop that completely and are comparing apples and oranges, then we get understandably different results. Okay. All right, so the first column here, and this is kind of showing this type of research. We're doing what you might consider, it's not a replication study, but we're trying to stay as close to the original study as possible and then tweak one thing. And actually, we're not doing that entirely. We're tweaking a few things, but one major thing. And the reason we do that is so it's easier to compare what did NAC get, what are we getting, why are they different. If we've only tweaked one major thing, then you can say that that's why they're different. Right? So this first column here is giving us results that are essentially the same as what NAC got. So just to focus your attention, if we look at the first coefficient, you can see that there are no stars on it. And anybody who's seen these kind of papers, stars indicate statistical significance. Okay? So although we see a positive number here, we can't be confident that it's not really 0. It's not statistically different from 0. Okay? We can't reject the hypothesis that it's 0. All right. So that is consistent with what NAC gets. The interpretation of that is that over the long run, foreign aid has no impact on democracy. This is using the countries that NAC includes and the years that NAC includes. We then expand the set of countries, so it includes all countries for which data were available, so that's up to our full 122. And there it switches over to being statistically significant. All right, so this is now saying that, in fact, if you look across a broad array of countries, aid does promote democracy in the long run. And we do a couple of other things here. We go back to NAC's countries, but expand the number of years that we're looking at. And again, aid promotes democracy. And if we do everything of all the data, right, all the years, all the countries, again, we get the result that aid promotes democracy. Okay.
Why did you choose 72? Is that the first day you had data?
Yes. So Freedom House's data.
Why did you choose 75? I guess there's a better reason.
Yeah. So he had other, and in fact, this is maybe getting at, was he cooking the books when he came up with his results, right? because he chose this. He chose certain countries, certain years. And I think it's fair to say he wasn't cooking the books. He included some variables that we're not including. He included, in particular, illiteracy rates. Okay? And it turned out that illiteracy rates wasn't available for all years in all countries, so that narrowed down the group he was looking at. He then found that illiteracy rates were statistically insignificant, so that you don't necessarily have to include it. And when you drop those out, then the group expands. It also turns out that the provider of these data, which these days is the World Bank, but there are other providers, they have changed their mind since 2004 and decided the data they published back then were junk, and they've raised their standards for data quality. And now, if we were to include illiteracy, we would have like 30 countries, because all that data has been taken out of circulation. They say it's not worth using. All right, so another reason not to use illiteracy, which he couldn't know about back in 2004. But all right, so that's what's driving the difference in samples. All right, it's not that he was out there trying to pick which countries were going to give him the answer he wanted. It's bad luck in data.
Well, and the other question is that the 2000s that changed it, or was it the 70s that changed it?
So you can see here that this is if we do all countries, but the same years he used. All right, so any of them, any change will do it. Right? We can either use his country, all countries and his countries and all years. Any of those changes is enough to give you statistical significance. All right, so in some sense, he was lucky or unlucky, however you want to term it. Okay. Great. All right. So this is also using our interval regression technique that I've described. So trying to use all the data, all the information in the data. We've done a couple of other things. There might be concerns about what economists term endogeneity, which you could call reverse causation, right? Namely that rather than aid causing democracy, democracy is causing aid. When donors see that a country's become more democratic, they come and dump more money in, right? The country became more democratic in 1980. The money came in 81, 82. But we're averaging over the whole period, so we don't see that timing, right? So we deal, or maybe a more modest ways, attempt to deal with endogeneity by looking only at part of the variation in aid. We look at the variation in aid that is caused not by democracy, but by other things that are arguably independent of democracy, namely the initial infant mortality rate, the initial population, and colonial heritage. Now, we're not claiming great insight in doing this. This is exactly what NAC does as well. So we're just following his method again. We're using what are called his instruments. And we're doing it both in terms of our interval regression and then also in terms of a regular regression. And in both cases, the result holds, and in fact, we end up rejecting the hypothesis of reverse causation.
I'd be curious to see what would happen if you threw out the European cases, just because of the huge wave in the early 90s, and almost certainly the ex-post aid that came in after the policy.
So that actually works against us. It turns out that a lot of them got huge amounts of aid right at the beginning, and the first Freedom House score that's available is, so the timing is wrong. So it actually works against us. If we throw them out, the results get stronger, not weaker. But that is something that we thought of right away. It could all be just driven by Europe, right, and the transition from Soviet to free countries. Okay. So that's, again, just following NAC. Another thing we do to follow NAC is look at early aid. So his argument is that if there is some kind of reverse causation story, it would be minimized if you looked at aid that flowed in the first half of the 25-year period, its effects on what happened across the whole period. And so that's one of the tests he does. We do it again with this early aid, as we're calling it, and we get the same comparable results as we do before. We take it a step further, and we say, well, how about breaking it down and just take the aid that flowed between 1972 and 1990, we're calling that previous aid, and the change in democracy from 91, after the aid stopped, to 2011, right? So in terms of the reverse causation story, that would be very hard to tell because this is literally aid that came before changes, right? It's also an extremely hard test because we're using aid from the Cold War period, which everybody holds their nose when they talk about it because all the donors were up to fighting the Soviet Union and whatnot, not up to trying to promote democracy and whatnot. We were propping up dictators and all sorts of things. So that's like the worst kind of aid you could pick. And in spite of all that, in spite of this difference in time and the quality of aid, we still get a positive effect. All right, so that's taking his approach one step further. All right. We do a little bit more playing around, running other things just to see are we getting results for random, strange reasons. Is it all driven by one part of the index versus the other? The answer there is no. If we switch to measuring aid per person instead of as a fraction of GDP, does it change things? No. The scales change because you're now measuring different things, but the statistical, the implication is the same. Using some alternate estimation methods that have been suggested in the literature, this one, if you believe our model, makes no sense. This one, if you believe our model, makes great sense, and both of them give us the same kind of results. So that's just trying to show it's robust. It's not driven by some random thing that we ran into by accident. Okay. So that's our, and I guess I've got a little summary. Oh, there we go. A little summary of this. That's the first part, looking at the big picture over the course of decades. Does aid have a positive effect on democracy? And so our answer there, obviously, is yes, we find evidence of that. And in terms of interpreting this, the time frame makes sense for thinking about aid as a general input, not as somehow a targeted specific input about democracy. The impact we find, though, is, although it's non-trivial, meaning it's not likely to be zero, it is small. If you increase aid by 1 standard deviation, and for those of you who have like a photographic memory, that is essentially doubling aid for the average country, and maintain that over decades, which is a long time, all right, you will see the 0 to 100 score increasing by 7, or in terms of the 1 to 7 score that's used more often, a rating that's used more often, you'd see it increasing by half a step. Okay, so that's something, it's measurable, not necessarily something to jump up and down about, right, because it's kind of small. Okay. Any questions before I quickly dive through the next part?
Last one, if you don't mind. So I noticed that when we looked at the descriptive statistics, some of them changed in the negative direction. Right? So there was a minimum of negative 3.5 a while ago.
Yeah, some countries go backward.
What kind of aid do they get in that? And then to bring it to this level, how does that impact your models? Because it seems strange that you're essentially penalizing the models. You're giving them no aid and they're moving in the wrong direction, versus you're giving no aid and they're not moving at all. Right? I mean, are they getting aid? And I'm just curious how it affects the modeling that's happening as well. Have you looked into that at all? Or sorry, how many countries actually went negative?
That's a good question.
Negative 3.5, but how many of them
Right.
went negative?
I have to confess I haven't looked directly at that, so I should look back at that. You will find countries that are going backward getting aid, because there are a lot of reasons countries get aid. So you can find maybe examples with Pakistan going backward, but ramping up of how much aid they get. So I don't think it would be, like those countries all got zero aid. Things are much more fine-grained than that. But it would be useful looking at those cases where countries go backward and see if they're somehow systematically different than the cases where countries move forward. And maybe we can talk later if you've got fancy ways of looking at that. That would be interesting.
Well, the simple way is just take them out and rerun the models and see how it changes. Right?
True.
Take out the ones that went negative.
Mm-hmm.
But imagine it also biases towards the null, where you're just going to get a larger effect. If you
Right.
take them out, I would guess. But
The odds are right, because that everything's moving in that direction. Yeah. Okay. Right. Other questions? All right, so we're going to switch gears now, and I'll try to be faster. We're looking at the short-run panel. In other words, aid coming in, causing changes in a short period of time, like over the course of a year. Right? So this is now thinking about either aid as a specific input or aid acting as an incentive. Right? The typical thing, and you've actually seen us do this before, is to try to use what's called instrumental variables to deal with reverse causation problems. All right? Here, that's not going to make any sense when we're looking at incentives. So people worry that when you see that a country got a lot of aid and its democracy got better, right? That was simply aid following democracy rather than aid causing democracy. And the knee-jerk reaction of somebody doing this kind of work would be to say, okay, so find variation in the aid that's not driven by democracy, right? Then we don't have the reverse causation story. The problem is if we're looking for an incentive effect, that's the country saying to itself, if we democratize, we will get that aid. In other words, you have to see the aid that's caused by democracy. Otherwise, you're losing the whole story. Right? So we're going to have to take a very different approach here, trying to get at it, in a sense, sideways, to see whether we find things that are consistent with an incentive effect rather than directly measuring the aid flow. All right? Because the aid flow is, the direction of causation would not be clear at all. Okay. So we're going to have a three-step approach here. We're first going to look at the way donors allocate their aid in response to democratization. We're going to use that to try to figure out how recipient countries' expectations about the rewards to democratization would vary. And then we're going to try to use that variation to identify whether that then leads to democratization. Okay. All right. So the first step here is we take a bunch of donors and we run regression equations that are supposed to explain why they gave some countries a lot of aid and other countries very little aid. This is done, again, at a yearly basis. All right, so we're not talking the long run anymore. We're very focused in on the short run. And what we find here, so let me explain a little bit of this. The US military aid is a dummy. That is to say, it's an indicator. It's a 1 if you receive substantial US military aid, which we interpret as you're geopolitically important to the US and its allies. And it's a 0 if you got trivial amounts or none. All right? We then again are including the Freedom House score, last year's democracy, and then we multiply that by the 0-1 variable. So it allows us to see, are things different? Maybe that's what I've got here. Are things different when the country is an important US ally versus when it's not? All right? And this row right here is going to tell us whether there is a difference or not. I put all the countries, the donors that are in this table because there is a difference. All right? And it turns out that in a statistical sense, so first of all of them are responding to democracy. The more democratic you are, the more money you get. But this one being negative says that that effect is smaller if you are geopolitically important. All right, so for countries that aren't geopolitically important, let me pick a good one. This is how Italy responds in terms of responding to democracy. For countries that are politically important, add these two together. Anybody want to guess what you get? 0, right? And in fact, for all of these except Japan, the two, in a statistical sense, the two completely cancel each other out. Japan, there's still a bit of an effect, but not large. So what this says is that if you're not politically important, the level of democracy is going to affect how much money you get. If you are politically important, forget about it. It's not going to matter. You're going to get the same amount of money either way from these donors. Right? And we call these donors the conditional donors because their responsiveness to democracy is conditional on geopolitics. Right? Second set of countries, France, Germany, we throw in, following Bermeo, the autocratic countries and then multilateral aid. Here you can see that although they all respond to democracy, there's no conditioning on geopolitical importance, at least as measured by the US variable, which is the only good measure that we have at this point. Okay? So these countries are unconditional. Doesn't matter whether you're geopolitically important or not, they're going to respond to changes in your democracy the same way. Get better in terms of democracy, you'll get more money. Don't get worse, you'll get less money. Okay? All right. So the argument here is that if you rely mostly on these countries, then your incentives to democratize are going to be conditional on your status. If you rely mostly on these countries, then your incentive to democratize doesn't rely on anything. It's just there. All right? So that's the difference that we're going to try to capitalize on. And I'm going to skip over, I've got more descriptive statistics. I'm going to skip over that and jump to the estimation results. We again are using our interval regression approach. And I've got a bunch of things here, but in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on the key point in terms of incentives here. All right, so first of all, we look at, are you getting U.S. military, significant amounts of military aid or not? And if you are, then it's more likely that democracy took a step backward than a step forward across 1 year. Okay? Although that effect, if you work it out, ends up being fairly small. It's statistically significant at the 90% confidence level, so this is telling us that countries that get a substantial U.S. aid are likely to be regressing in terms of democratization. Now, our story says we expect that. However, I'm sure each of you can tell another story that would also give that result that's got nothing to do with the incentives of foreign aid to democratize and so on. So it's consistent, but it's not really very convincing yet. So we take it the next step and we say, let's multiply that or look at the case where you are the recipient country, the democratizing or not democratizing developing country, is very dependent on these conditional donors who sometimes enforce their rules about democracy and sometimes don't care, right, if you're geopolitically important. Okay? And there we see a much larger negative and significant result, meaning that when you're geopolitically important and you rely on those donors, we're going to see big steps backward or failure to move forward, depending on what the baseline is here, in terms of democracy. All right? So the story I was telling is suddenly a lot more credible because this is now focused only on the ones where it should matter. The other ones shouldn't be important. And in fact, the last column here does exactly that. It includes the cases where this effect should be important and the cases where this effect shouldn't be important. These are the countries that are relying mostly on, now I can't even remember my list, but France and the other countries that were unconditional donors. All right? And there, whether you're geopolitically important or not, doesn't have an impact on your change in democracy. All right? So we've sidestepped the problem of using aid directly that would have had this reverse causation issue, and instead followed a story that logically would say this should happen if there is an incentive, and this should happen if there isn't an incentive. This or this, right, the case where you rely on conditional donors and you are geopolitically important, is the case where you do not see incentives to democratize. And there we see, or aid incentives to democratize, I should say, and there we see worse performance, right? So that is our attempt to add to this literature saying, let's get at the incentive effects. So just to summarize things, we see that aid, and this is the first part, that aid promotes democracy in the long run. That's thinking about aid as this general input that just creates the type of economy, the type of society that could democratize. And it's a small but non-trivial effect, and that overturns the sort of the stylized fact in the literature. When we look at the short run, and I didn't talk all the results about this, we see a small but non-trivial effect in terms of aid as a specific input. We see that aid from autocracies or China does not have this effect. For some donors, strategic interests override democracy. That's that first group of conditional donors I talked about. And that identifies when the expected aid payoff to democratize exists. We find that there is an incentive effect, and I didn't go into the numbers here, but that turns out, of all the things we've looked at, that turns out to be a large effect. Okay? Which, of course, makes the economists happy because we always think incentives matter, and if we can show that the incentive is really what counted, then great. All right, and I think that's all I had prepared. I realized I've gone on pretty long. I'd be delighted for any questions people have.
It's just an embellishment, I guess, that might be interesting to see, is the degree to which movements, upward movements in democracy had anything to do with either, I mean, it's kind of old school, but either they democratized with the same regime, or whether there was a regime change.
Right.
And whether the conditionality then, would apply if there was a regime change.
Right, and I mean, this is...
Due to, run two separate.
Right, and so there's been some work by Joseph Wright at Penn State on things like this, using a different framework. And his argument is that an incentive only matters if the current ruler gets to stay in power. Otherwise, somebody else is getting the benefit. Why would I give up my dictatorship for some future Democratic leader to get some big aid payoff, right? So I think that's an interesting issue to look at. There's obviously limits to what we can do in one paper, but that sounds like a very good thing to pursue in another paper. On the flip side of that, these incentives aren't applying only to leaders, right? So if I'm in civil society and I'm thinking about, do I fight hard for movements toward democracy or not? When I see payoffs to that, and those would be general payoffs to the economy, to the country, maybe specific to my interest group, but when I see payoffs to that, which aren't necessarily payoffs to the current regime, I'm going to push harder for democracy. So it's not, what I'm saying is it's not a black and white story. It's not that the incentives would only affect the current regime. There are actually other things they would do. But you're right, the current regime is the one, obviously, with the most control about what happens, and so their incentives matter the most.
But then you would also be concerned about the mode and the qualitative type of aid, because some aid isn't going to be distributed. You know,
Mhm.
rulers may. So I'm just thinking there might be very discrete infrastructural projects that aren't going to benefit.
Right. I mean, that gets us into the whole issue of aid fungibility and whether the fact that it's a discrete investment or infrastructure project has a different effect on the overall envelope of government resources versus if it's just given as free money. Something to pursue, but I think there are a lot of complicating factors. It's not quite a black and white story. Yeah. Great. Any of my students who'd like to pipe up with anything? All right. Thank you very much for coming, and I'm happy to answer questions later.